We'll text them.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Find her if she looks.
Good morning.
Now, so we can get started. We have a lot that I want to go over today. But what I'm going to start with is I'm going to do a quick review of what we covered last week. I know we have a couple of new faces, and it'll lead into pick up the conversation. So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is well and staying healthy and staying strong and keeping your sanity. I see some of us are growing our beards to be, looking very, very dashing these days. That's right, Brian. Debbie, not so much, thank God. Right? So our conversation last week and today is about this idea that we call in our tradition the Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim, the debate or the discussion or the argument for the sake of heaven. And as a quick reminder, the lightning bulb, the light bulb went off over my head a few weeks ago about this when I was sitting around thinking, like, how do some people like to pass the time? They pick fights with their loved ones and their housemates just so they have something to talk about. And if we think about the history of our tradition, and if we put ourselves in the minds and in the seats of the ancient rabbis, whose lives were not nearly as busy as ours, they spent a lot of time sitting around discussing things for three reasons. For the sake of discussing them, as a reason and a way to pass the time, and also, as they concluded, for the sake of heaven, right? This idea of L'Shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And so in the tradition that is filled with a history of different people debating ideas back and forth and offering us certain insights as to the ethic around that, right? And the emotions around that, and what makes one debate L'Shem Shamayim and others not, right? What are the principles that the various parties bring to it? In addition to wanting to just say what they think, what makes one type of debate sort of good for us and good for the people and good for the Jews and ultimately pleasing to the Holy One? And what makes other types of debate less so? And that's where we're going to take the conversation. So I'm going to share now the PowerPoint that we used last week. So here it comes. You should be able to see on your screens now. Let me just adjust my Zoom window so I can see everybody while we do that. Very good. Okay. So this idea of the argument for the sake of heaven, we're not going to watch the video again. The core, the sort of text of all of this is this verse from Pirkei Avot. From, this comes from the Mishnah, from the late 2nd, early 3rd century of the Common Era. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, and one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Right? So one of the ways which the tradition talks about this is that those debates that go on and on and on and on and on and are constantly returned to, but never have 100% resolution, that in itself is an indicator that it is for the sake of heaven, right? If it's something that you can very easily sort of come to a conclusion on, it is not for the sake of heaven. But if it's a thing that people continue to discuss and debate back and forth year over year, generation over generation, century over century, millennium over millennium, that is an indication that it might be for the sake of heaven, right? And those are the type of controversies the text suggests that Hillel and Shammai debated, right? We talked last week the idea of the debate over which direction should we, how should we light the Hanukkah menorah? Should we light one candle the first night and 8 candles the last night, or 8 candles the first night and 1 candle the last night? That debate, which is described in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, is an example of a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim, because we can continue to learn from the conversations that Hillel and Shammai had in their time, and we can bring our own wisdom to it. And we've had those conversations even in our own time. And what was an example of a debate not for the sake of heaven? Korach, right? Korach, who raised an argument against Moses. And how did the Holy One respond to that? Threw them all opened up the earth, threw them all in, covered them over, and killed them all, basically. If God steps in and intervenes in the world to kill you over the arguments you are making, probably not an example of an argument for the sake of heaven. You've probably shown that you have upset the Holy One by doing so. So this text is about 1800 or so plus years. We have some commentaries we looked at, right? We looked at the commentary of Bartanura, right? Who suggested that, and it's in the middle here, the argument which is for the sake of heaven is one that is trying to get to some sense of truth, right? Now we know, for example, that almost every time Hillel and Shammai have a debate, that the halakha, the end legal opinion, follows what Hillel suggested. But the debate was there, and at no point are the arguments that Shammai made discounted as being not valid or not well reasoned or not well principled. It's just that on balance, Hillel's arguments are held higher, right? From a dispute, the truth will be clarified as it became elucidated, and the law was there. An argument which is not for the sake of heaven, and this is the more important thing, the desired purpose of the arguer is to achieve power and the love of contention, and the end will not endure, as we saw from the example of Korach, whose ultimate aim was to achieve honor and power, right? Why was Korach so interested in debating? What was he ultimately trying to achieve in that? Raise your hand if you have an answer. What was he trying to do? Feldman's.
He was to replace Moses.
Yeah, he was trying to strip Moses of his power and usurp. It was an attempted coup d'etat, right? Korach felt in his heart that Moses was not the proper leader. It was that he wanted to be the leader, and he was trying to use the skills of debate to take away power. That ultimate motivation there, and we'll see this return to again in Hillel as the example of someone who was as the body who was trying to simply increase and further the attempt at truth. And if it happens to be that truth puts me in a better position, fantastic. But it's the truth that we're seeking. Sfat emet, right? Someone who's a little bit closer to our generation, right? Certainly modernity. Voicing one's own, I love this teaching. Voicing one's own opinion, even when it may be at odds with others, causes people to rethink what they believe is correct. This reminds me a lot of someone I doubt this Sfat emet ever learned about, but John Stuart Mill, right? The great political philosopher who talked about the marketplace of ideas, right? That in a debate, even if something seems to already be settled, it's still good for opposing ideas to be offered because it allows for the marketplace of ideas to strengthen its own sense of what is right and wrong, right? We're having some very interesting debates right now in our society about the balance between the economic health of our country and the physical health of the members of our community, right? And we're seeing people raise questions that, maybe a certain number of lives to be lost are worth it to protect the economic health of our nation. Now, I find that to be morally offensive to be raised because we come from a tradition that says that a single human life is as valuable as the entire universe, right? But, and from a certain perspective, the fact that someone is raising the question, are human lives worth more than economic health, is giving me an opportunity to remind myself of what I know to be true, which is that human lives are of the ultimate good. I don't think that they're right in raising the argument. I don't think that they should be raising the argument, but by doing so, it does give me opportunity to remind me why they're wrong. And there's something small good to be said for that, right? So Sfat emet suggests that when you raise opinions that are not popular, it may disturb the peace. However, it's a way to achieve one's potential, right? Each of us, he suggests, were created for the purpose of accomplishing something distinctive and special, right? The legislators who think that we should basically let people die to protect the economy is not that. But how many times in human history has one person seemingly out of left field idea been the thing that got everybody to where they needed to be? right? We just celebrated a week ago the 50th anniversary of the successful landing of Apollo 13. How many out-of-the-box ideas had to be generated in a very short period of time in order to bring those 3 astronauts home, right? That's a great example of this, where someone had to think, let's use this thing that was never designed to be used the way we're going to use it as a way to achieve our. If everyone had said, everybody who works at NASA, take the devices we have and push their intended use as far as it will go to see if we can bring them home, they never would have made it home. But when the question became, think about all these things these devices could do that they were never designed to do, but might be able to do, that's how they got them home. Using sleeves of spacesuits to redesign CO2 scrubbing cartridges to fit literally a round peg in a square hole, or a square peg in a round hole. I forget which way it went, but like those innovations are an example of this. And Sfat Emet says, however, but I would say, and participants in such a dispute must always bear in mind that one's individual contribution is only truly significant if it benefits the community. Those engineers who were thinking up all that those crazy solutions down in Houston were not doing it for their own glory. They were doing it for the health of those 3 astronauts and for the good of NASA and for the good of the US. Another example of the other side of this. We spoke last week how the Sfat Emet, a Chassid, had that wonderful teaching of Hasidism in his heart, right? That we should all carry in our pockets 2 notes. One note that says, the whole world was created for me, and the other note that says, I am but dust and ashes. That we see ourselves, that we ought to see ourselves in every moment as the one most important character in all of human history, because what we offer might change the course of human history, and that we are one of billions of people, and that our contributions only matter when they contribute to the entire purpose, right? If I think that the whole world was created for me, and I only think for me is the only example of creation, I am not good. And if I only think that I can't do anything because I'm only one of so many, and I have no way to influence the world, also not good. It has to be both one and the same at the same time. I've been thinking a lot about this recently. Then we jumped, and I think this is where we ended. This is where we ended last week. Getting back to this idea of what is the heavens, right? Now this is where we're going to jump off going today. We talk about this idea of a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim, and this wonderful teaching from Lumshitz, who was from the 16th and 17th centuries, mostly the early 17th century, who was the rabbi of Prague, asked the question, why, when the space that we call the heavens had this describer of the rakia, right, the firmament, what was God trying to accomplish in the story of creation when God renamed that space Shamayim from rakia, right? And I raise this because if we're talking about these debates being a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim, if they are a debate for the sake of heaven, we should ask ourselves, what is heaven that we are trying to reach towards in these debates? And this teaching that the Kliyakar suggests is that the problem with the word rakia is that it had to do with separating, right? It's a barrier between 2 places. The word rakia is sort of this flattened line, and the etymology is the idea of like, if you take a piece of metal and you smooth and flatten it out, you create these sort of barriers. And so the idea of the rakia is a divider between different places. And it does not say in that example, as the Kliyakar suggests, that it was good, because when you create division, you create the room for disagreements, right? Not unity. And the notion of renaming that space Shamayim suggests that we're trying to create some kind of unity in that. And so a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim is a point of disagreement whose ultimate goal is deeper unity. That's really powerful, right? And the goal is sort of as pre and post, right? You enter into a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim because your ultimate goal is to deepen the sense of unity among the people, right? As we discussed last week, when we think, for example, and I'll use the example of the Hanukkah menorah again. Why is it that Hillel and Shammai engaged in a debate about how to light the Hanukkah menorah? Their ultimate goal was what? Their ultimate goal was trying to find the thing that the Holy One wanted us to do, right? The core principle of the rabbinic undertaking is we know what God wanted from us in biblical times because God told us so in Torah. The reason we talk about the oral Torah is it was a second iteration, right? Once the practices that the Torah describes, the temple rituals of sacrifice, once the ability to do that was lost because of the destruction of the temple, the entire rabbinic undertaking was, okay, since we can't do those things that God told us to do at Sinai, what then does God want from us? And that ultimately is what the rabbinic tradition is. Starting in the Mishnah, continuing through the Midrashim, which are explaining the blank spaces in Torah, culminating with the Gemara, which becomes the Talmud when included with the Mishnah. All of that is the rabbi saying to the best of their knowledge, to the best of their faith, this is what God wants us to be doing in order to serve and to worship and to create relationship with the Holy One. Right? From a more traditional perspective, the notion is that that text was always there, that the oral tradition was explicated at Sinai, but the same reasoning is, this is what God wants us to do, right? If we want to think of it in a more historical perspective, which is that the origins of the text are later, but the purposes of the text are the same, to teach us what we believe the Holy One wants us to be doing, right? Including what's the proper way to light the Hanukkah menorah, so that the entire Jewish community is doing it with the sense of unity. Hillel and Shammai are using the best of their wisdom to tell us what they think God wants from us. They bring reason and wisdom and insight to that. Shammai makes a compelling argument, right? The miracle of the oil included a diminishing amount of oil day to day. So the ritualized recreation should have a diminishing amount of oil. Light 8 candles, then 7, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. Makes a whole lot of sense. And Hillel says, you know what, that makes a whole lot of sense, but we don't need to be beholden to replicate the ritual exactly if we have another value, which is increasing our sense of joy as the holiday goes on, right? With every single passing day that the miracle continued, our people became more joyous because it had continued. So let us increase our joy through the holiday and add a candle every night, so that on the last night we are at full illumination of joy, both of which are reasonable. We all agreed to follow one teaching because they were both trying to give us that one unified teaching that brought us together. All right. That was last week. Now we can move forward. Are there any questions? I'm going to sip my coffee. We can go forward? All right. Rav Kook, the great 20th century rabbi, late 19th and 20th century rabbi, born in Latvia, and of course, famously the first chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the land of Israel, taught this. Rabbi Eliezer said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, students of the sages, Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, cause peace to increase in the world, as it is said in Isaiah. all of your children will be learned of God, and great will be the peace of your children. There are those who err, thinking that world peace will not be built except by means of one form in points of view and qualities. Therefore, when they see students of Torah scholars inquiring into wisdom and the knowledge of Torah, and by means of their searching, the perspectives and approaches multiply, they believe that they thus cause arguments and the opposite of peace. What he's saying is there are some people who mistakenly believe that wisdom in truth is of a single line through history, right? That it's organized, it doesn't come out of a sense of a cacophony of ideas, but we can move truth from point to point to point throughout history. And that if your learning goes in different directions and you bring in a multitude of ideas, you are going to cause arguments, which is the opposite of peace. This is the straw man that he is setting up. Yet, truthfully, this is not so, he says. For the true peace cannot come into the world except by means of the value of a piece of many faces. A piece of many faces means that all sides and approaches are seen, and it becomes clear how there is a place for them all, each one according to its worth, its place, its content, right? It's not that wisdom comes from one place, it's that wisdom is the amalgamation of a variety of ideas, a variety of perspectives, a variety of values, a variety of senses of place and content. And only when they all come together do you get this sense of peace. On the contrary, all positions that appear superfluous or contradictory will be seen once the truth of wisdom is revealed in all of her many-sidedness. For only by means of coming together of all the parts and all the details, and all of the views that seem different, and all of the divided branches, truly by their means the light of truth and righteousness will appear, along with the knowledge of God, his reverence and his love, those are his words, not mine, and the light of the truth of Torah. Therefore, Torah scholars, Talmidei Chachamim, all of us who learn Jewish, increase peace. For just as they broaden, they explicate, and give birth to new words of Torah, in locating new aspects out of different aspects, in which there is multiplication and division of themes, in this they increase peace. As we digest that, I'll open up for response, comment, question, wonder, agreement. Alan, go ahead. You got to unmute first.
So doesn't your comment, going back to the beginning comment about there being only one answer, whatever. Many people believe that there's only one answer. I mean, for example, the ultra-Orthodox Jews believe there's only one answer. It's through Judaism, ... Islam believe there's only one answer. They don't come together to talk about different views. They'll talk about different views within their own little sphere, but they won't go outside it. How do you reconcile that?
So I think that what you just suggested, Alan, is partially correct and partially not correct. You're right to suggest that ultimately we most often have to come to a single perspective, right? A single position. This is what we are supposed to do. What I think that Rav Kook is talking about, and I think this whole conversation is about, to make a very unkosher metaphor, how the sausage is made, right? That the position of a particular rabbi or of a particular sect or of a particular whatever, and I think this is probably true outside Judaism as well. Our tradition encourages debate and the inclusion of a multitude of ideas as a way to eventually get us to the one answer to which we seek. What Rav Kook, I think, is warning against is the inclination to say, well, this position seems already to be settled, and I have this datum, whether it's a piece of factual information or it's a spiritual perspective or an emotional perspective. I have something in my head that might upset what seems to already be settled. I think he is warning against fear of bringing that up. If you have something that you think will contribute to the debate, even at the risk of potentially changing that unified perspective, you should bring it up. Because maybe we've always been wrong because we didn't have the one perspective that you now have. And maybe your new perspective will cause us to change our opinion. And by the way, in doing so, we'll please the Holy One. Right? I mean, Alan, you're an attorney. You get the idea of precedent. Right? And precedent lasts only as long as something becomes so overwhelming that it causes the judges or the justices to change because they can no longer ignore what they see as the truth. And if if Brown had said, listen, Plessy versus Ferguson is settled law, right? And we cannot bring up a notion that separate but equal is valid. If we can't challenge that because it's settled. It certainly was not peaceful to bring the arguments of the civil rights era into America. It certainly upset the peace. And I think Rob Cook, obviously he predated that, but he would have said, yeah, good. Upset the peace now in search of the ultimate good and truth that will come out of it. Brian.
Isn't this a challenge to any fundamental approach and any authoritarian approach to a conclusion?
Yeah. I think that we sit in this really interesting place in Jewish history, right? As Reform Jews, as Jews who take a lot of the tradition with big grains of salt, as Jews who are as interested in the process and the history of things as much as they are what the conclusions that were made at a given time, maybe even more so in the history of things and in the processes and the ultimate conclusion, whereas other streams of Judaism seem primarily interested in what's the halakha, right? What is the way that we're supposed to do? That our perspective is to suggest that those who are interested in the unified halachic position seem, from our perspective, to be more authoritarian, right? And we might suggest that our tradition is authoritarian in its notion. Rob Cook was seated in the position of authority, right? He was the chief rabbi of Israel. And when there was a question of halakha to be practiced by the Ashkenazi Jews of the land of Israel, his opinion was ultimately the one that they were bound to follow by the teaching of our tradition. What's so interesting about that is what I think the magnanimity that he demonstrates here in this position, right? He is the authoritarian, and what he is saying is that even a system that relies on rabbinic authority needs to be open to debate, needs to be open to contradictory ideas, maybe even superfluous ideas. Because ultimately, whose authority is Rob Cook demonstrating and acting upon? Not his own, and not even the Jewish people's. I see people muttering answers to themselves. Fran, I saw your mouth moving. Unmute yourselves and say what you were going to say.
Was that me? I don't know.
Fran. Fran, we can't hear you. You got to unmute.
Oh, I thought another gentleman is who you called. I wasn't clear with.
On you.
Okay. All right. So what am I feeling about that right now? God's in charge. He's the one that is working it. He's going to go to
God's authority, right? And so God's authority is devolves down to the rabbis, but ultimately, Rob Cook has to know that his wisdom, while immense, is limited, right? And so he's encouraging the sharing of ideas that might seem new, might seem out of the box, might seem contradictory, superfluous, because when those ideas then get funneled through the halachic process, one of two things will happen. Either we will become further convinced because we can think of reasons why those new ideas are valid, but ultimately not what we should be considered to be operative, and we should retain our original position now in spite of these new ideas. Or, chas v'shalom, we change our ideas to incorporate those new wisdom, and that makes our sense of confidence in our position even stronger. So, Brian, I'm kind of pushing back against your notion of authoritarianism, which isn't to say that there aren't people in different groups today who I think act authoritatively, in an authoritarian manner, right? And there are fundamentalists, but fundamentalism isn't the only thing that they're operating under. And within the closed group of the closed set of who they are, there is a sense of play. Now, the challenge is that there's been so many generations of this happening that, like, they've kind of debated all the things that there are to debate. I mean, the history, why there is the Hasidic movement, right? What the Hasidic movement in the 17th century was responding to was the fact that for so many hundreds of years, the students of the yeshiva had debated all the principles of Torah and all the principles of Talmud and all of the primary commentaries of Rashi and the Tosafot, that they had basically pulled every string so far apart that they had gotten so into the weeds, and the word for this is called pilpul, that they were debating, you know, the thickness of the ink on the little tail of the comma, that they had lost the forest for the trees. And the Hasidic movement suggested, you know what, guys, there's a forest out there. And that in addition to seeking the Holy One in debating the minutia of the minutia of the minutia, we also should go look and see the Holy One in the larger principles, like in the forest, in the earth around us. We should be learning of Torah and be experiencing the world around us, and we should be seeking the Holy One there. And I raise it to suggest that I think a good Yid carries both of those at the same time, right? Yes, we debate the minutia, and we see the bigger picture, right? And I think that within the various groups that you're alluding to, that does exist to a various set of degrees. We are much more of the, let's go find God in the trees, right? Let's go find God at Camp Coleman. Let's go find God at a beach cleanup, right? Let's go find God marching at a gay pride rally, right? That's kind of who we are. And we focus a little bit less, or a bit less, on the minutia. But we do carry both, right? Because we do debate things, right? When we sat down many years ago to create a dietary ethic for the synagogue, and we came to the conclusion that we were going to let this eat and not that eat, we were doing some of this as well, right? In our own way, but we were doing that as well. And by the way, there will come a time in the future where we will revisit some of the decisions that were made by that dietary committee, because it'll be time. New ideas will strike us. Maybe we're going to add. Maybe we're going to change the opinions. Maybe we're going to add a sense of ethics, right? That we're going to say we don't care about kosher food, but we want food that is sustainably sourced, and that we as a synagogue are only going to serve food that is sustainably sourced, or we're going to seek to only serve food that is sustainably sourced. Maybe we'll have that opinion added onto our dietary ethic at a certain point, because those are some of the principles that we hold to be dear, less so than how is the animal shechted, as an example. But I love what Rob Cook is teaching here, which is that don't fear that the new idea will upset the peace. The peace will survive. Run the new idea through your system of debating ideas. And if it's L'Shem Shamayim, the peace will be upset, and ultimately you'll find the equilibrium again, and it'll be stronger because you have the new idea incorporated. Fran.
There's so many issues that are going to be debated, and it's really scary. And what really scared me yesterday or 2 nights ago is that interview with the mayor of Las Vegas and Anderson. Now, I have worked in casinos. I have dealt with people and tons of money in casinos. I have had I was a supervisor for 25 years in the casinos. And when I heard that woman the other night, I just, my husband too, because he was a supervisor, we were beside ourselves about the mayor who does know nothing, she said, about casinos and how she wants to just open it up.
Yeah.
I want to feeling about that.
And friend, what has been the overwhelming response to her commentary?
I believe that people on Anderson's side will be a go. I hope, but then I don't know.
Right. I think people saw the mayor's comments as being particularly foolish. Right, and I want to bring this next text as a way to frame that. So this is the text from Eruvin from the Babylonian Talmud. It's a continuation of the description of Hillel and Shammai. For 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. One said the halacha is according to our position, and the other said it's according to our position. And then the bat kol, the voice from heaven, spoke, and they said these famous words: Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. V'halacha kebeit Hillel, but the halacha is according to Beit Hillel. A question was raised. Since the heavenly voice declared, both these and those are the words of the living God, why was the halacha established to follow the opinion of Hillel? All right, so here are we. We have two conflicting opinions. Open the casinos and don't open the casinos. Right, so, and then we have this voice of the heavens saying, you're both right. Right, or at least there is wisdom on both sides of this. Right, and I think that the modern situation of trying to sustain people's livelihood and sustain their health and life, those are the words of the living God. There's nothing wrong with trying to help people sustain their livelihoods, right? That should always be our compulsion. How do we help people sustain their livelihoods? It's important, right? It's important because the lasting damage, by the way, what we're hearing about is the possibility of 250 million people going hungry because of the economic downturn, the global economic downturn, right? Economics and livelihoods trickle down to people's life as well. They both get there, right? So wanting people to go back to work is, I think, Divrei Elohim Chaim, words of the living God. However, it's only one argument in a debate, right? And we see that the opinion of Hillel was followed. Why? It's because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught from their own ideas as well as the ideas from the students of Shammai. Furthermore, they even taught Shammai's opinions first. This text is suggesting that the path to ultimate truth, which is seen almost often as being the path of the house of Hillel, is one that incorporates the values of both sides of the debate, that recognizes not just what the end argument is, but recognizes what value proposition your opposition is trying to uphold, right? And in this instance of the debate we're having right now, it's trying to open up the economy for business, because there are a whole bunch of reasons why that is of and in itself a good, right? Because it ultimately concerns with people's life, it concerns with their livelihood, their ability to feed their, all that kind of stuff, right? That we're doing lasting damage to our country by not having the economy open. There's no question about that. We would also be doing lasting damage to our country by opening the economy, because people would I mean, it's on both sides of this. So we're asking ourselves other questions. What can we do to help sustain people's livelihoods even if we can't go to work, which is why the things like the stimulus package and the small, we're looking for other ideas to keep it so that people can still do the things they need to do for themselves, to sustain their livelihoods, to minimize the damage. And by the way, we're probably not going farther enough, right? The fact that we're debating now reopening things in our society may actually just be prolonging this, right? This balance of how deeply do we have to close down and for how long so we can end this crisis. Some may have argued we should have closed more deeply and faster, right? We should have had total shutdown for 3 weeks a month ago. I'm not an epidemiologist, right? But like, those are the various perspectives. I personally feel like this sort of soft closure is going to just have it go like this. It's going to go up and down and up and down and up and down. And I'm aware of the fact that as I look around the group here, there are people on this conversation for whom this is not just an intellectual exercise, but for whom they have friends and loved ones who are experiencing this, right? This is not about statistics. This is about individual people's lives who may or may not survive this because of all of this. And I want to make us cognizant this is not just navel gazing for some people. This is real. And that's why it's so difficult, because the reality, which is when it's people's lives and livelihoods, and every single life is worth the entire universe, well, if that's not L'Shem Shamayim, I don't know what is. But what we see from this text here is that there is holiness on both sides of most arguments, and that our job is to seek what are the holy values on each side, and how can we reconcile and incorporate them. And what made Hillel so powerful is that the house of Hillel would see the values of Shammai's side and find a way to incorporate them within their own opinion and perspective, within their own policy, right? So for example, and I'm making this up, I've never heard this before, but I'm making it up. You could also make an argument about the Chanukiah, that we should just have it be 8 candles every night, right? If it's about celebrating a miracle, why do we have to attenuate it by having multiple numbers of candles from small to big, right? And so what you could argue is, well, Hillel saw that Shammai's argument for an attenuation, right, a dynamic miracle reenactment has value because it more deeply demonstrates the experience of the Hasmoneans. So Hillel says, great, we should break it up and have different candles every night, but rather than have it go down, we'll have it go up. It's like they incorporated one of the values of Shammai, turned it on its head to then get 2 values, attenuation and increasing joy. Brilliant. Questions about that before we move forward? I see flinching of hands, but no one wants to go the whole way. All right, we'll move forward. They, again, Hillel and Shammai, they related that since the dispute was so intense, they were in a deep debate, they stuck a sword in the study hall. Imru, hakanesa ikanes. Let one who seeks to enter the study hall, let him enter, and one who seeks to leave may not leave. They locked those who came in. That day Hillel was bowed and was sitting before Shammai like one of the students. Gemara said, and on that day it was as difficult for Israel as the day the golden calf was made. And Shammai and Hillel issued the decree, and the people did not accept it from them. And their students came and issued the decree, and the people accepted it from them. This is complicated. What's going on here?
They're all locked in. Whether you accept it or you don't accept it, there's a lock-in.
Yeah. Why was that difficult?
Because some cannot tolerate and endure the pain that they're in. So there's the endurance and the toleration about the issues.
Yeah.
And they're ready to,
Yeah, the threat of violence seems to be antithetical to this notion, right?
yes.
Might does not make right. That's not how our tradition operates, right? You can't threaten people to change their mind. You can't threaten people to stay in the conversation. It has to come organically, right? I'm really curious about the end of this, where when it's just Hillel and Shammai, it's not good enough. But when the students get involved, then it seems to work. That there's a larger sense of agreement around this. Let's hold that in our hand. Or Natalie, go ahead before we move forward.
Yeah, because you always need to have a buy-in. That's the truth. The decision won't hold.
Yeah.
If 2 people make it and 200 people don't agree with them. You've got to get everybody to buy in. It's not enough for the person at the top to say what's what.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to skip this next one. What it basically says is that although Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagreed on principles of purity and marriage and all that, they still allowed each other to marry each other's daughters, even though they disagreed on the laws of marriage. Right? They had a deep respect for each other, that their intellectual disagreements didn't get in the way of their cultural and their communal sense of love for each other. All right, this is a troubling text. And this is the continuation of the story from Shabbat. We are now looking at a text from the Jerusalem Talmud, the same conversation. On that day, Oto Hayom Haya Kesheli Yisrael Kayom Shena'aseh Bo Ha'egel. That day was as hard as the day of the golden calf, right? Because on that day, the students of Beit Shammai stood below and were killing the students of Beit Hillel. That introduction of the sword was not just a threat, there was a slaughter that went on. The students of Shammai resorted to violence, right? The 9th of Adar is one of those days that is recorded where there was internal strife. The days in which terrible events happened to our forefathers, and it is fitting to fast on them, including the 9th of Adar. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai divided, right? They no longer were engaging in lively debate. They went to war with each other, right? The warning here is, keep it up here. Keep it in here. Don't go here. Don't go here. Keep it civil. Remember what the goal is. The goal is not to beat the other person. The goal is what? To seek the truth of the Holy One of Blessing. Jack, you had your hand up. Jack, you got it. There you go.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, I think the basic difference between, as I understand it, is that Hillel, being the president, was compassionate and had a general view of what was going on and was very empathetic and considerate, whereas Shammai basically interpreted the law as he saw it. There was no give and take. I mean, when God first approached our world as we know it, it was in chaos. And by dividing things up, God brought light into the world, because now instead of being in one room and yelling at each other, you would divide it up and you could talk to each other rather than intervene with each other, so no one heard anything. And I believe here that Shammai's goal was to interpret law and to live by what he believed the law was right. Hillel, on the other hand, not only knew the law, but had compassion.
Yeah, I think that's really, really true. And yet it leaves, I'm sympathetic to Shammai personally, because the truth is the truth, right? The law isn't like, if Shammai's legal insight was stronger, right, in some ways you could argue that he had a better understanding of what God purportedly wanted from us. And Hillel was the one who was sort of softening it, right? It reminds me, on a similar vein, of the debate that we talk about God's characters of Din and of Rachamim, right? Of justice and of mercy. We don't deserve mercy. Justice is what we deserve, right? When we call on God to be merciful, we are calling on God to break the law on our behalf, right? And that may be what we want, and that seems very Hillelish, right? To ignore the clear text of the law in our favor. I think Hillel is compelled by that, and I think Hillel is grabbing onto the notion of Rachamim that comes from our descriptions of God to say that the black and white law isn't always the right thing to do. And by the way, there's wisdom there, right? There's wisdom in not prosecuting jaywalking, right? Or not prosecuting certain examples of legal breaking because it just feels like it's the wrong thing to do, even if the person who broke the law also did the wrong thing, right? And I can think of a variety of examples of that. Jack, go ahead. You want to follow up?
Yeah, if we encompass Hillel and Shammai, I mean, God is our Father and our King. He not only has justice, but being our Father, he has compassion, taking justice in consideration. The Sanhedrin dealing with Hillel and Shammai were basically two faces of God. I mean, essentially, there was the Father and there was the King. And I believe that just obeying the law sometimes is not the answer to get things done. You have to have both involved.
What's amazing is when we think about different principles of authority throughout human history, they very often rest on two competing values, right? Even Machiavelli, right? Love and fear, which I think you could probably paint that up against Rachamim and Din, love and fear, mercy and justice, right? That there's something universal even about this. We may have had it first, but it seems to be almost universal. All right, we are getting close to the end here, both in terms of time and of wisdom. Rabbi Yanai said, if the Torah had been given sliced, right, with no clear answer to every question, there would be no room for the leg to stand on. There'd be no room to maneuver. Moses said, right, Ribono shel olam, right, Lord of the universe, tell me, what's the halacha? And God says, follow the majority. We see that in Exodus 32. If those who acquit are in the majority, acquit. If those who find guilty in the majority, find guilty. So the Torah will be interpreted with 49 faces impure and 49 faces pure. Forget for a moment the canard of the sort of criminal law aspect of this. The most important piece of this is at the very end. When the Holy One is suggesting to Moses, that every question of debate has 49 reasons for this side and 49 reasons for that side. What does that mean? It means that you can't say that any position is so obvious that it has to be. That every position has to be incorporative of a variety of opinions. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of living God. It's not black and white. It's not. It's black and black, or white and white, or whatever color you want to say. There's meaning on both sides. And if you say that my way is the only way to see this, you're denying the truth of things that God has said. Because those 49 facets on the other side, you're denying their divinity and their holy worth. So don't do that when you enter into debate. Another example. Moses was wealthy. Asher veselecha, as it is written, hew for you, which was derived, the waste of the tablets of the covenant shall be yours. The broken tablets shall be, or not the broken, the the waste, when the tablets were inscribed, the dust and pieces that came off that were originally part of the stone, but that were moved to inscribe the tablets, became precious and became Moses' possession. And that's why he was wealthy. That he was wise is derived from the statement of Rav and Shmuel, who both said 50 measures of understanding were created in the world, and all were given to Moses except one. You have deprived him of little, right? 50. What's 50 minus 1? 49, right? That even Moses had the wisdom of the 49 facets, but even he did not have the fullness of all 50. That he was deprived of one. Now that makes him wiser than everybody else, but not as wise as Ribono Shel Olam. He lacked only complete knowledge of God. And that made him humble. Because he knew that even as wise as he was privileged to only 49 of the 50 facets. He only got a 98% on his final exam. Not 100. And that we who are Talmidei Chachamim, we who are students of this, have to recognize that as wise and insightful as we think we are, we do not have all 50 facets. Not even 49 of the 50, because only Moses had 49. Our wisdom is less than we think it is. And that humility ought to inspire us as we enter into debate. There may be things that our opponent, the person we're debating with, understands better than we do. And if you understand that about yourself, you'll be more like Hillel to seek the understanding of your opponent and ultimately be better. I'm going to leave us with two platitudes. This is from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs from his book, Dignity of Difference. Truth on earth is not nor can be the whole truth. It is limited, not comprehensive, particular, not universal. When two propositions conflict, it is not necessarily because one is true and one is false. It may be and often is that each represents a different perspective on reality, an alternative way of structuring order, no more and no less commensurable than a Shakespearean sonnet, a Michelangelo painting, or a Schubert sonata. In heaven there is truth. On earth there are truths. Therefore each culture has something to contribute. Each person knows something and no one else does. The sages said in Pirkei Avot, who is wise? One who learns from all men. The wisest is not one who knows himself wiser than others. He is the one who knows all men have some share of the truth and is willing to learn from them. For none of us knows all the truth, and each of us knows some of it. Even Moshe Rabbeinu. And we are but slivers of the shadow of Moshe Rabbeinu in our wisdom. Last one. This is from this new collection published a year or so ago, the Social Justice Commentary on Pirkei Avot. By the way, I'm happy to make these slides available to anyone who wants them when we're all done. Shmuel Yanklowitz, who is really become a crusader for the good and the right in our world today. A comment on our original text, that original Pirkei Avot about Hillel and Shammai and the Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim. We dare not retreat in fear when we encounter challenges. And when we argue for what is right, we should do so knowing that our words are heard by the divine ear. While knowing that the world is not just black and white, we must weather the storm of opposition if our ideals are to remain holy. Considering the contrary arguments, one gains knowledge, but one finds opportunity for dissent when dissent is just. According to Rabbi Elise D. Frischman, when we listen to Torah, we are listening to God's voice. But this is not necessarily what God speaks. It reflects what we hear. Dialogue between two people grows not from what is said, but from what is heard. Who will win the argument? The Josephs and the Daniels of our age, or the Belshazzars and Pharaohs? The choice is ours. incredibly powerful. We get to choose who we listen to. We get to choose how we listen. We get to choose whose arguments we make as our own and whose that we do not. And every time we do, we contribute to the sense of either seeking the peace or pulling away from it in debate in the world. What is a Makhloket L'Shem Shamayim? It's a debate when the contributors are seeking to make peace, but knowing that sometimes you have to break the peace to make the peace stronger. And keeping your compass on that is probably the hardest thing. I'll leave it open for questions. That good, huh? Thank you, Fran. Jack, go ahead.
By the way, thanks for this. It really was great.
Thank you.
I think there was one section where we didn't talk about enough was it Hillel that said, no one can leave, but anyone who wants to come in can come into this conversation?
Yes.
I think they were leaving because they were fed up with what was going on. They weren't leaving to eat lunch. And as a result, he was saying, you can't leave the table. You have to stay here until we all see what's happening and come to some kind of compromise. That may just be me, but
we're locked in till we've made it this, till we've come to an agreement. It's interesting. You know, our president, Temple President Mark Sunshine, talks about our organization being one of collaboration, right? And that when the board makes decisions, he doesn't want everyone to agree, but he wants everyone to be satisfied with the process. Satisfied that those who disagreed were heard, and that there's a sense that we're all moving together on these decisions. And the board have had to make some very difficult decisions in the last couple of weeks, responding to what's going on right now. And I really respect that notion, that this sense of collaboration and this sense of a cohortative kind of experience is reflective, Jack, of what you just said. I think that episode, though, the notion of the sword becomes challenging, because we know that same sword, while may have been used in that moment to encourage a sense of collaboration, was then turned around to be used as a weapon of slaughter. Maybe it would have been better if it was, we know the etymology of the word conclave, right? From the pontifical conclave. It comes from the Latin conclave, right? With a key, because they're locked in. Maybe the locked key would have been a better tool for Hillel in that moment than laying down a sword. Well, before Fran starts making book and dealing everybody in, I wish you all a wonderful Thursday and a Shabbat Shalom. We obviously have a lot of things going on in the next couple of days. We've got, there's clergy chat tomorrow at 2. There's Shabbat services tomorrow night at 7:30. There's Torah study tomorrow, Saturday morning at 9:30. And some wonderful things coming up in the next couple of weeks as well. Check tbeboca.org to see all of those things. I wish you all a pleasant rest of the day.
Thank you, Rabbi.